Hello, I'm Claire Michkowski, a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for being with us. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the bipartisan mission of the Dole Institute. Members of the SAB receive opportunities to network with guests and preference when applying for our internship assistance or for paid student positions at the Institute. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoyed today's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Our past and future programs are available to watch on video on our website. We'd like to encourage each of you to get special benefits and support the Dole Institute by becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Let us know if you are interested. I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the program, we will have time for questions and answers. If you have a question, raise your hand and a student helper will come to you. Please ask just one brief question. And now, please welcome Director Bill Lacey.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks to all of you for coming out on this beautiful day for what is going to be a fascinating discussion of Colonel Charles Heller's book. We heard about this book about a year ago. Dr. Barbara Ballard, who's our Associate Director here, mentioned it to me, and we decided at that point that we wanted to have Colonel Heller here at the Dole Institute, but we were looking for perfect timing, and some of you may have been at or may have heard about the program that we did 2 years ago in the summer on the sesquicentennial of Gettysburg. And we were going to, tomorrow night, and this is where I'm getting to the point I'm going to make, but tomorrow night we're actually featuring a couple of historical interpreters who will be reenacting Appomattox, the surrender at Appomattox, and it'll be General Lee and General Grant. And I would encourage all of you to think about coming over tomorrow night. It's a different time for our normal evening programs. It'll be 7 p.m. Tomorrow night here at the Dole Institute. But when we scheduled that program for tomorrow night, then I wanted to schedule this program to me because this is early in the Civil War era. That's the end of the Civil War era of history, and we just thought it was a perfect complemental program. We're so delighted that you could come out today. We have copies of the book on sale. I bought my copy. All of you can buy multiple copies if you like. Great gift. You know, you've got Easter coming up, so a great Easter gift. But anyway, the books will be on sale outside. As I said, we're delighted to have Charles E. Heller, who's a retired U.S. Army colonel, here with us today. He served as a professor at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. During his tenure there, he developed and taught a genocide and mass atrocity seminar at the death camp in Auschwitz, Poland. Previous to this, Heller was recalled to active duty and assigned to the Joint History Office, Office of the Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon in Washington. In addition to a decorated military career, Charles Heller was director of the evening college and summer sessions at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, adjunct instructor at Ottawa and Baker Universities, and an assistant professor at Washburn University. We had a chat this afternoon. I got to meet him for the first time, and I know you're going to enjoy today's program. Please welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, Colonel Charles Heller. Charles?
Thank you very much for making me blush. Well, thank you all for coming out on this beautiful day. I had a lot of competition, and I realized that as we drove here and told my wife. But I think the time will be well spent. And I may repeat what I said at Compton, some of that here, but bear with me. It's always different when I talk to a different group. History is what people remember, and sometimes memories are short. In this case, they fade completely when we talk about the man I'm going to tell you about, George Luther Stearns. It's very, very difficult to break into historical circles, especially publishers, with someone that people don't know about. They would rather do the umpteenth book of Lincoln than take a chance on a new book. And I've been told this by several universities who I approached to publish the book. The fact of the matter is that Stearns is an extremely important figure in the Civil War. Brown may not have gotten to Harpers Ferry without his support. And as we know, The Civil War starts here in Kansas with Brown and others on both sides of the border. So I'd like to take you on a journey through a man's life, George Luther Stearns. Now, the beard is medicinal. It was grown on doctor's office because Stearns had bronchitis several times, and his father had died of bronchitis, or bronchial pneumonia. So the doctor said you have to grow a full-length beard to cover your chest. Stearns was from a poor part of the Stearns family that had come over with the, not the Mayflower, but early settlers in New England. His doctor, though, his father was a doctor who was on the poor side of the family and worked as a physician and as a schoolmaster using the Stearns residence for young students to make a living. When he died, and he died early, and Stearns was very young, Stearns was sent to work in Brattleboro, Vermont, with relatives, and came back and found a job in a ship trannery office down on the piers and wharfs of Boston. He does well. He's a clerk, and he grows in stature, knows the business, and eventually his first wife's father, she passes away, trusts Stearns enough to loan him enough money for him to open up his own chandlery. And so he starts a steady rise in society, at each job making more and more money and gaining more prestige in the community. He realizes that the China trade and trade with Europe is growing, and the demand for ships is going to increase. While he does well, he's got a small operation and decides to do something that was a bit of a gamble, but it worked. He decided to go into the manufacturing of linseed oil. Now, in those days, linseed oil was necessary to cure the wood for ships, and a lot of it was used for these big sailing ships because they were all wood. And so he embarks on a career. Now, during that career, he is joined by his brother, who unfortunately has had a problem with drink. And so he's literally a silent partner, but Stearns endures because of his mother, for his mother's sake. And his mother is a very harsh woman, a Calvinist to the core. And Stearns is raised in that house. But he overcomes a lot of problems that he has with his mother and goes on to get involved in this trade. Now, he builds a factory. And to save money, he uses cheap coal, bituminous. And so he's polluting the atmosphere in Boston. And it bothered people even in those days. So he's held to account for the amount of bituminous coal smoke that he's throwing out in the local neighborhood in Charlestown, near Medford. And he also wants to save money with a chimney for the diffusion of the steam from the boilers for the linseed oil. And it empties out right into a schoolyard right nearby. And a young child tells people many years after he's famous that they used to run in and out of the hot steam for fun. Stearns didn't do anything about that. Eventually, he gets to his last business, lead pipe. Now, in those days, lead pipe was used for water in tenements in the rising cities. And here, too, he's forecast the future and the growth of cities. Now, there's a debate. Everybody knows that lead pipes create lead poisoning. So what people did in the tenements would run the water so it was fresh and then take a drink from there. I'm sure there are still traces of the lead. But there was nothing else to replace it, according to the dialogue among physicians at the time, at that point in time. But Stearns hears about a new process. Rather than rolling it and welding a seam, he finds someone who can actually create a tube that's seamless. And this is the patent that I found in the patent office, and it's done hydraulically. And so he knows the patent that he has, has been stolen by a young man, and he goes to the people who actually invented it, the Tatum brothers in New York City, and he asks to use the patent. Well, in those days, if someone else started a business like yours in pipe, you didn't worry about the competition because distances were so far that you weren't going to export your pipe from New York to Massachusetts. So they allowed him to use the patent. But he made sure about that. He gained so much money that he builds a mansion on what is now Tufts University property. And it's in the trees. I hope you can see it. I'm not sure you can with the light, but it is has a mansard roof, a long drive between trees, orchards and vineyards, and in the background is the Stearns Steps, a train station right near his house. And the avenue that goes horizontal in the front of the mansion is known as Stearns Avenue even today. And Tufts has all the land. The mansion is burnt down in the 1930s, and his grandson told me, was in correspondence with him, he lived in Florida. I think he was retired at the time, an older man. And he said that when the place caught fire, all these papers, some with John Brown's name, came swirling around. And a lot, I guess, was lost to history. But after doing this, he's got a second wife. Both his wives are named Mary, so he had no problem with getting in trouble with the second one. And she's not a status climber, but she didn't like him getting into the lead pipe business because she didn't think it was proper, colorful enough, or important enough. But the money was there, and throughout the time that he was working there, they decided to mix with Boston and Concord society. And one night they went to a lecture by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and they invited Emerson to spend time with them that night instead of going back to Concord on the rail line. And he stayed there, and they became good friends. In fact, the reason that they were so close is they had two sons that were very close in age. And I guess one of the Stearns boys came downstairs and told Emerson that he had something to show him. He showed him a toy locomotive. And Emerson said his boy would like to discuss the mechanics with him. So they became good friends. And through that, other members of the Concord literati. Bronson Alcott. If you read or saw Little Women, you know that he was not a very good businessman, and he had a very large family, and he was always in need of money. Stearns loaned him money whenever he needed it. So he had a good relationship. And then when Lusame Alcott started to write, by that time, and I'm going ahead a little bit, but I don't want to forget it, Stearns buys an interest in the Boston Commonwealth. And she publishes her first work, Hospital Sketches, after she gets back from Washington, D.C., where she's treated Union soldiers, and he publishes that work, Hospital Sketches. But he does know the Alcotts. And here's a picture of Lusame that probably looked like that at that age. The one thing is in his life, about in the 1840s, he's sort of drifting away from indifference to slavery. Complete, it doesn't exist here, so I don't have to worry about it. But he becomes increasingly alarmed about this slavery and the possibility that it might spread in the new territories. So what he does is he follows politics closely, and he joins the Liberty Party. He's the only person, and he's a Whig, of course. The Whigs bring our modern-day Republicans, favoring business and trade and industry. And he votes, even though it's not a popular thing to do. There's still antipathy towards African Americans, the Irish migration in the 1840s. Most blacks had to leave Boston because of the job competition, and the Irish forced them out. But things like this bothered him very, very much. The last straw was the beating of his lawyer, his attorney, Senator Charles Sumner, in the Senate. We think the rhetoric's inflamed and people don't get along in the Senate, but Bully Brooks from South Carolina beats Charles Sumner senseless in the Senate. Sumner is a big man and gets caught in those narrow, small desks, and he's beaten with a silver-headed cane. And the Stearns know him so well that Mary, to help him recover, sends him a box of wine, Tokay, hoping that he gets better. But again, it's slavery, and slavery, he believes, is not a good idea in a capitalist democratic society, that it will actually hurt growth of the United States. He finds out about Kansas. The New England Immigrant Aid starts soliciting funds by issuing a stock. Now, he becomes a director, but he doesn't like the buying stock in profits to be made from settlers. He thinks it should be sheer donations, charity, to support Freesoilers here in Kansas. So what he does is he and his wife form a Kansas Relief Society. And in those days, women are used by abolitionists a lot because they sympathize with African American slaves more so than males who are busy with their own job or whatever, field competition or whatever it is. So she goes about raising money, and Stearns does, and they have an organization that grows so large that they actually have agents out here in Kansas distributing the goods, giving loans out to settlers. And it becomes a big organization, so much so that Amos Lawrence says, we need to cool Stearns down. He's detracting from our business. But he ignores them. He comes out here once, just once, and he writes back to his wife that he enjoyed himself in Lawrence, drinking whiskey cocktails with the rough men of the town. So he enjoyed his stay here very much, and as we know, drinking still goes on to a great extent, only students this time. As a result, John Brown hears of him and comes to Boston to seek him out for aid, for money. And a fellow by the name of Sanborn, another one of the conquered literati, not literati, he writes about them after they're all dead. But Sanborn introduces him, Brown, to Stearns. And they meet like the steel and the magnet. And through that meeting, Stearns becomes convinced he's found a man to do something about the curse of slavery in the United States. This will be his knight in shining armor. He can't do what this man claims to have been doing in Kansas. Now, he avoids the Potawatomi massacre and all those other things, but he knows that Brown has been out here freeing slaves and fighting the border ruffians. And so he goes whole hog and he creates something called the Secret Six. And these men join Stearns to support John Brown. But the money, the majority of the money that Brown has, the pikes that are made in Connecticut, the Sharps rifles, are Stearns's money at work supporting this violent revolutionary. Now, he's supposed to use the Sharps rifle, and I've got it in writing, for defense of Kansas. We all know where they wind up. They wind up in Harpers Ferry. Well, Theodore Parker's one, and he's a fiery abolitionist minister. He leaves just before the raid on Harpers Ferry. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, another minister from Worcester, Massachusetts, firebrand, a lot of talk, and then he goes and forms a black regiment in South Carolina. But he doesn't, other than talk, he does very little to help Brown financially and, of course, support. Howe instituted the blind, know him, his wife, Julia Ward Howe, Battle Hymn of the Republic, or John Brown's Body, whichever version you want. The soldiers like John Brown's Body. Joins him. He's a veteran of the wars in Greece for freedom from Turkey. He and Stearns, when Brown is captured, flee to Canada. And Stearns leaves him, and after Brown's execution comes back. Garrett Smith's a wealthy land owner in New York. He provides most of the support for Brown's family while he's gallivanting around Kansas and other places seeking aid and weapons. So that's the Secret Six. And then, of course, I've told you about Sanborn, who just is a young man who's attached to himself and writes about them all when they pass away. They knew that Brown was going to do something. There's no doubt about it. But they didn't know where, and they didn't know when. And they thought that his plan was to start a slave insurrection and go into the Appalachian Mountains. And when news came that he had been bottled up in Harpers Ferry, the fire station, where he made his last stand, they became extremely nervous. And Stearns again and Howe fled. It's an odd position. It's at the confluence of two rivers. Brown lets a train go by. They get to the next station where the telegraph is still up. Wire Washington, D.C. and Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart and a few Marines come up and they attack Brown, and of course he's overcome. And then he's tried in Charlestown and executed. Brown is not left without hope. Stearns tries to organize a rescue party for Brown and his men. He can't do that, he fails. But he also is such a businessman, he also tried to get his Sharps rifles back. And his agent reports back that he better not do that because it is treason, armed insurrection, and that he better just let it go. Besides, most of the arms had been stolen by Pug Uglies, a gang in Baltimore, and he wouldn't get many back. He testifies at the Senate Armed Services, the Senate Commission on Harpers Ferry, and one of the senators talks about the rifle, and Stearns says, I don't really care, basically. I did it, and the good Lord will bless me for supporting this man to liberate African Americans in the South. He's not a fan of Abraham Lincoln, but when Lincoln passes the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, Governor John Andrew of Massachusetts wants to recruit a black regiment early, not wait for the Emancipation Proclamation in January, but September. And he turns to Stearns because there's a small black population because they've been chased out literally by the Irish. And he calls on Stearns, a businessman and an organizer, to recruit. So Stearns is the recruiter of the 54th Massachusetts and the 55th. And I'll tell you later that he goes on to do more. But right now, he is the man that doesn't appear in the movie Glory. Now, Frederick Douglass does. But he hires Frederick Douglass to be one of his recruiters, and he recruits Douglass's two sons for the 54th Massachusetts and follows their career. And that's how I found Stearns, by looking at a book on the Black Regiment, A Brave Black Regiment, by one of the officers of the 54th Massachusetts, white officers. And I don't know how many have been to Boston, but this is a marvelous relief by St. Augustine, and copy is in the museum, the art museum in Washington, D.C. He goes on to try to help people in other regiments recruit African Americans for the Union Army. Now, eventually, 186,000 blacks serve in the Union Army, and that's not to mention the Teamsters, the people that help the engineers dig fortifications, the women who do the cooking and sewing. So the black contribution is considerable, but Stearns helps that move along. Secretary of War Stanton helps it along by not only hiring Stearns, but giving him a commission, a direct commission, as a major, as an assistant adjutant general for the recruitment of colored troops. Major George Stearns recruits over 13 black regiments. A regiment table of organization is about 1,000 men per. And he does most of this recruiting in Tennessee. He comes in contact with Andrew Johnson, who's a virulent racist. And he has to walk around. He thinks that Johnson is helping him, while Johnson's sending Stanton, the Secretary of War, a telegram saying, "Get him out of here, get him out of here." But he stops Andrew Johnson's men from impressing blacks to work on fortifications, and rather than that, put them in uniform and pay them. He not only does that, but he takes their wives and young girls and educates them, reading and writing, and also has them trained to be domestics while their men are learning to fight. He orders that chaplains in each one of the black regiment are responsible for teaching them to read and write, the men. So he does a lot of work there. He also buys 2 plantations, cotton plantations, and he calls them cotton farms, and he frees all the slaves, and he tells the slave owners near him, because it's a border state, so slavery still exists, that he can make more money by hiring people and paying them wages than they can with slaves. And he buys 2 of them. Now, after that, he runs, Stanton won't give the 54th Massachusetts the same pay as white troops. He has trouble getting black soldiers in the 54th commissions, and he has a break with Stanton and quits. But he goes on to do other things. He goes back to his business and solves the problem of lead pipes. He finds a guy who knows how to line the lead with tin. So he starts that business, and of course, he profits. He looks for other ways to do something to benefit African Americans after freedom. So he forms the Impartial Suffrage Association. And Godkin was the first editor of the Nation. He bought the Nation thinking he could use the magazine to help further civil rights for African Americans, and it fails miserably, and there's a big fight, and he loses his stock and a whole bunch of stuff. But after emancipation, it's civil rights. It's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments he's after. And he has already formed an organization, the Impartial Suffrage Association, to do that. Unfortunately, all of these efforts really wear him down. His second wife believes in homeopathic medicine. He still has bronchial problems, which is why he still has the heavy beard. And he goes on a business trip to New York, and he falls ill with pneumonia. And she rushes down there with her doctor, who douses him with cold water, and he dies in 1867. So he's not there not to promote himself, but be a figure that would probably have been very active in Reconstruction. And certainly, unfortunately, for an interesting reason, he was the last of the abolitionists to break for Andrew Johnson. So Johnson must have been pretty sly as an individual to hide his feelings towards Stearns, because the telegrams to Stanton tell you another story. But he does other things too. I just found this recently, and it's in the book, but it's a few facts pertaining to the currency and banking adapted to the present position of our finances. George L. Stearns and Cornell reprinted it. And it's how to get out of federal debt. indefinite spending. But it's very, very interesting. So we've moved along a little rapidly, but I thought we'd end with this poem by John Reeve Whittier. He was known by everyone. I've got a whole 2-page sermon by Emerson, but this one I thought was very meaningful. And if you go to the last paragraph, you'll see. Let me look at it. No, not the third from the last. Ah, well, the world's discreet. There are plenty to pause and wait, but here was a man who sometimes set his feet in advance of fate. And when these are the remarks of on George L. Stearns, and he dies April 14th, interesting enough, same day Lincoln does. We're coming up on that date. And he ends it saying, "For the spirit of the universe seems to say, he has done well. Is not that saying all?" And so I thought that this man deserves some recognition, and hence I wrote the book. Now, I understand we have a protocol, and if you have a question, this young lady will come over and hand you the mic, and we can go from there. Questions? You must have questions. I won't let you leave the room without.
I don't know if this is pertinent, but do you know if the rifles that were shipped by Beecher to Kansas were Sharps rifles?
I think they were. I'm not positive, but if you're going to send someone weapons who are outnumbered, yeah, you would use Sharps, for sure. Ma'am, you had?
Yes, after Harper's Ferry, was George Luther Stearns concerned about being implicated? Garrett Smith, of course, took off for Canada. He was so worried about it.
Smith went to an insane asylum.
Oh.
Garrett Smith had himself admitted to an insane asylum. Howell went, and Sanborn a little bit. Parker was overseas, and Higginson didn't.
Theodore Parker was in Florence, Italy, where he died. Isn't that right?
Yeah. He was enjoying whatever it was, but. And Higginson was in the army already, and Sanborn. He is walking down the streets of Concord, and 2 U.S. Marshals jump him. And someone rings the fire bell in Concord, and the whole town rushes out and pulls the men away and kicks them out of town. So nobody's implicated. And and Stearns went to the Senate, and no one did anything. He testified. You can actually read his testimony. And he talked to Mason, who was, if you recall the story during the Civil War, of a ship officer that captures the two ambassadors of the Confederacy to England. Mason's one of them. So he's a diehard Confederate from the get-go. And he holds up the rifle and he says to Stearns, he says, "When you get to heaven, the old man is going to have some questions for you." And Stearns replied, "When I get to heaven, he's going to say, I've seen so many people regarding slavery, he's going to say, let the risk go."
So Stearns wasn't worried about being arrested?
He was initially. He did run, but that was an advice of his attorney, not Sumner. John Andrew, the governor, was. But he did go, and then he only came back after. Now you've got to remember that today we would consider Brown violating federal law. In the Civil War, guess who? Virginia tried him. And Stearns was never going to go into Virginia. He was never going to go anywhere south. He could go into a border state, but he wasn't going to go in the south because he knew what would happen to him.
What does channelry involve?
Hemp, rope, ship's bells, nails, tar, pitch. anything, that's an accessory. Rigging, they hem for rigging. They even manufactured that. You name it. And they would have compasses, ship's compasses, lights, that kind of thing. So you'd have it was sort of a department store of shipbuilding.
Across the street here in Pioneer Cemetery, there are 2 tombstones for the children and wife of Charles Stearns, and he was one of the founders of Lawrence. I wondered if you knew if there was any relation.
I was hoping he was because I found his letters, but he's not.
He's not. Okay.
He's not.
And another question I had, in Watson Library, before they took everything over to storage, there was a beautiful bound volume called The Right Way, George Luther Stearns' complete volume of
Really? Do you know where it is
newspapers. I asked that it be taken over to special collections, and I think that's
Good.
where it is. But could you speak a little bit about The
Sure.
Right Way?
I neglected to mention that he, at the end of the war, wanted to do more and more. And he decided to publish a newspaper and distribute it free of charge in the South with all these articles about how bad slavery was. And not how bad necessarily, but how foolish you are, because that capitalism depends on, and money, like me, Stearns, is gained by using free labor. So he circulates that for 2 years and then runs out of money and stops publication. I have microfilm of the entire. I'm just surprised. I found that in Topeka, too. So that's a story of The Right Way. Now, where did the name come from? One of his wife's aunts is a feminist. And I've just had a senior moment. She's, I'll think of it in a minute. But she writes a piece on slavery called The Right Way, and The Right Way is to free slaves. And I'll think of her name before we're over. Okay. Any other questions?
This is not really a question, it's just a plug. I saw from your picture that you have been to Harpers Ferry.
Yes.
And it's just a beautiful setting. There's 2 rivers and the mountains are all around. It's really, I don't know how many people have been there, but it's well worth a trip. And it's close to Antietam, so there's a lot of history right in there, and it's a beautiful area of the country.
Lucretia Mott is her name. A feminist. I don't remember. No, but let me follow up on that. Yeah, my great-grandfather's regiment was stationed at Harpers Ferry twice. Boulevard Heights and around there. And it's a beautiful location, and all the other sites are very close at hand. You could even get to not only Antietam, but in Pennsylvania, you could get to Gettysburg as well. It's a great location.
I've been reading about the Underground Railroad, and most of the abolitionists, a lot of them had some event that made them, either they saw slavery going on that made them an abolitionist, but was there any particular event that made him get interested in this? Or?
There was the return of a slave. There's 2 events that Stearns didn't witness but knew about him from Boston, and another slave that made it to Stearns' house. And he actually hid him in the water closet under the flooring. And the story goes from his son, who writes a book of him, is that there were some slave hunters wandering around the mansion. And I don't mean, this is the bias of the time. They were more anti-Irish than anti-black. He said that, fortunately, I had a Scots gatekeeper, not an Irishman, and he chased them away. But so those 2, and he did. The slave did get to he put him on a train the following evening and got him to Canada, where he also recruited a number of African Americans. He did a lot of traveling. I mean, a lot of places where you wouldn't expect him to go. but Massachusetts did not have a large black population. Please.
I went to school 100 years ago. When I went to school, why did they not cover? I didn't know that there was a black person that fought in the Civil War. That's the best part of your book, in my opinion, is the numbers. That is, so did they purposely, historians, ignore it, or did they just don't want to cover it? Why did that? Why was it hidden for so many years?
You know, that's fascinating because that got me started. I was in college in the 60s, of all times to be in college.
You're just a kid.
Yeah, well, yeah. But I did a paper on blacks using a book called The Sable Arm by a fellow by the name of Dudley Cornish. And fortunate enough, I met Dudley years and years ago. He commanded black troops in World War II. And I wrote the paper, you know, and it wasn't a scholarly work, and there weren't a lot of footnotes or endnotes. But my professor at Hofstra University in Long Island was flabbergasted because he didn't know. So I took it upon myself to start looking, and I have quite a collection now. And my first article published was in Civil War Times, and it was on the 54th Massachusetts. And the more I read, so by the time I was recalled to active duty twice, and the first time I was recalled, I was teaching history up here at Command General Staff College. And I had created a briefing on the military heritage of African Americans. And Recruiting Command would send me to inner cities all over the United States, not over the United States, but I was down in Houston, Texas, and went to all 7 high schools down there talking about it. And even the black children didn't know about their own heritage. And I thought it was sad that they'd been deprived of all of this. But think of it, 186,000 men in infantry, artillery, engineers, and cavalry. What happened was, we started with Antietam. You mentioned Antietam. 23,000 men die in one day. And the list going back north were horrifying. Now, this is in September of 1862. And all of a sudden, this volunteer army recruitment for replacements dries up. And that's one of the reasons that Lincoln passes a preliminary emancipation, because the governor is saying, we can't meet your quotas. How can we meet your quotas? Because no one wants to enlist after those casualties. And the answer is, here's a population who wants to serve to show whites that they can take care of themselves and free themselves. And so they flock to the ranks. But it disappears because of Reconstruction goes foul. It's a sad, sad story. It starts out as one of the best periods of our history. We've got integrated society in the South. There's construction that goes on. Schools are built, new courthouses. And then guess what? 1877, there's a compromise made. And the 7,000, the South always complains about being under the oppressive rule of Union soldiers. There are only 7,000 soldiers, Union soldiers, U.S. soldiers, in the South after the Civil War. Now, how many states are they in? They're in 13 states. Do you think they were oppressing the Southern people? But when the laws started, Jim Crow laws started to be passed, black legislatures, are disbanded by the whites, and the property-owning whites resume their roles in society, but rather than slavery, now they use racism to control the black population and stir up the yeoman farmer who's got to have, the white farmer who's got to have someone less than he is, or believe that there's someone who's worse off than him to be, respected. And so that's the story. And of course, that racism continues. And every now and then there's a shining light, like Theodore Roosevelt inviting No, Washington, yeah, Carver, George Washington Carver, to the White House. And in World War I, you've got 2 regiments that are detached from the 92nd Infantry Division, which is all black, white officers. And they're given to the French. Well, they win the Croix de Guerre and God knows how many medals for their combat operations. And the American commanders talk about the 92nd Division as those rapists. Now, you tell me what's wrong with that story. It's just something that it doesn't seem to ever go away. It's like anti-Semitism. It's the same thing. It just goes on and on and on. So that's the answer to a long answer to a short question.
Did any of them win, I'll say, Congressional Medal of Honor? Were they ever honored by anything even close to that?
Well, the highest ranking black officer was a surgeon. I know that. The 54th Massachusetts did wind up with some lieutenants, but I can't think of posthumously later on that happening. I'll have to check that out.
I can't enough hear about it.
I don't think so. And there were some like the battery at Fort Wagner. I mean, it was just absolutely amazing. I mean, they tried to assault that fort several times, and they were massacred. Our history sometimes is, and children don't know about these things still. It's not taught. And for example, the Holocaust. Do you know who teaches the Holocaust in schools today? They're not the social studies teacher, the language arts teachers, because you don't have time. And when you talk about it, you can talk about Rwanda and Bosnia and other places where it goes on. We're had it going on now in the Middle East. But there's the song from South Pacific. I don't know if you remember that, Tales of the South, James Michener. You've got to be taught to hate the people your relatives hate. You've got to because. I think Bloody Mary sings that, right? Yeah, she does. Because her daughter's having a relationship with a white officer. Did you have one?
Well, weren't most of the blacks in the U.S. troops, if they were captured by the Confederates, they were killed, weren't they? There weren't many imprisoned. I think, didn't the Confederates kill them?
Well, they were going to be enslaved again or killed, and the white officers certainly put to death. There's a massacre in the Mississippi River, a tremendous one. I'm trying to remember the battle there. And at other places, they were given the Battle of the Crater at Petersburg. Black soldiers were supposed to lead the last charge, to break Lee's lines. And Pennsylvania miners dug a hole to blow up this part of the Confederate trenches. And at the last minute, Grant has cold feet. He's afraid of being accused as killing blacks unnecessarily, and he pulls them back and sends two regiments of white soldiers who are not prepared to do it. The blacks were trained to go around the edge of the crater. And when they finally send them in, they get involved in the crater with the white soldiers all tangled up, and the Confederates come back and kill them. I mean, just like a turkey shoot. There's a recent book out about that one, and I for the life of me can't remember the massacre on the Mississippi. But just Google that, and I'm sure you'll find it. Not Pickens. Pardon?
Was it Fort
Pillow. Pillow. Thank you. Fort Pillow Massacre.
Yes, in Kansas, we claim the first black soldiers were recruited by James Lane, the 1st and 2nd Kansas Colored, before it was really officially allowed. and then they became the 79th and 83rd United States Colored Troops. They're buried out, a number of them are buried out in Oak Hill Cemetery because a number stayed here in Lawrence after the Civil War.
Stearns helped raise the regiments. Not recruiting, but getting the War Department to send equipment for them.
Interesting.
Yeah, he lobbied for that. But yeah, I think there's a book coming out on the first Kansas Colored. Someone's doing it.
There was a PhD student that here at KU that did it.
Yeah, I'd be interested. There's an article, I think, in American Heritage magazine years and years ago that's very good about the first Kansas Colored.
In your view, as you would summarize Stearns' character, what do you think are the critical developmental variables that influenced who he was as a person?
He was a hard worker, self-made. He was religious but didn't believe in institutional religion or Christianity. He said, and I quote, he didn't want the Word of God to come to him through a keyhole. That by doing good works is the way to heaven, basically. I think he was, sometimes I think he's a bit naive. I think he's a little bit browbeaten by Mary. I think that basically he was just a very good man who really believed in what he was doing, and he literally gave his life for black, not only emancipation, but civil rights. It's hard to get to grips and be objective about people you write about. You sort of get attached to them, and and I've got to face the issue of Brown, violent insurrection and stuff. But Stearns meant well. He told Brown that it was for the defense of Kansas. Well, maybe the defense of Kansas and the Union depended on the abolition of slavery. I don't know. But he was even going to go back to Europe with Samuel Gridley Howe to get involved in another revolution going on there. Oh, and some of his friends he has visit the house are Hungarians who fled from the revolutions of 1848, and he took them in. So he's just that kind of guy, I guess. Better man than I, Gunga Din, that's for sure. Anything else? I guess that's it. Thank you very much. I want to thank you. Bill and Barbara Ballard have what you have today, intellectual curiosity. And that's rewarding that citizens are interested in things like that. There's been a big debate in the Wall Street Journal about the liberal arts and the death of liberal arts. Well, I don't believe in that. I think they're essential because it's all about people. I believe that leadership is all about people, and people are what makes it happen and make it all worthwhile. And as the Old Testament says, to save one life is to save the world. And I strongly believe in that, and I think Stearns did too. So thanks a lot for coming. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.